Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where we bring you the biggest developments coming out of the Middle Kingdom, so you're on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony, and welcome. Things are a little bit different this time. People who've watched us before know that this is coming out a little bit early, and you've probably noticed it's a little bit shorter. For everyone who's joining us for the first time, we basically give you guys the big developments coming out of China. We do like a deep dive into 4, 5, 6 of the biggest topics that you need to know about China for the week. But this week I have to go to Shenzhen to meet some clients on a business trip. So what we're going to do is film this a little bit earlier on the Thursday and release it on the Friday, and it's probably going to be a little bit shorter. I'm going to film it now, edit it on the plane, and when I hit the hotel, I'm going to chuck it up. So let's just jump into the news and talk about the biggest stories that you need to know about. Smash through them, just like I know you're going to smash the like button if you enjoy the stuff. We're 5 weeks in, and that sort of support is a huge help for us. If you're new on YouTube, the likes are really useful for the algorithm. So let's jump in. Okay, let's talk about China-US relations. There have been some hiccups over the board. Congress is passing the Hong Kong Freedom and Democracy Bill. The US has sent warships through the Taiwan Strait. There are issues with universities. But of course, the big news is the trade war and that phase 1 trade agreement, and whether it's going to get across the line by the end of the year. Now, there's a whole bunch of aspects to the trade agreement that we have discussed in depth in previous episodes. The IP regime, how it's going to be implemented, where is it going to be signed. These are all minor details. The two biggest issues currently that are standing between a successful deal and a non-successful deal are agro purchases and whether the American side will reduce tariffs before implementing the phase 1 deal. Let's hit on both of those very briefly. Agribusiness. Now, we've discussed this in previous episodes, but there is a bit of an issue about how much agribusiness, that is the purchases of agricultural products, the Chinese promise to make. Now, the Chinese have indicated that they will buy pre-trade war levels. This is about 20 billion a year, which for reasons we don't need to go into here is already a tough sell. The American side, specifically Trump, has said that they agreed to $40 to $50 billion. Now, this would be a massive increase in purchasing from the Chinese side. Like I said, pre-purchase levels were 20%, and the demand for things like soybeans are nowhere near what they were pre-trade war level. So this would involve the Chinese either buying stuff they don't need or completely cutting other countries out of their supply chain. The other issue, of course, is have the Americans agreed to reduce the tariffs that they have put in place since the trade war began in April of last year. Now, the Chinese have pushed very heavily for the last week or so this idea that the Americans must reduce some of their tariffs before the Chinese do the same, and that this is a prerequisite for any so-called phase 1 trade agreement. Now, it did seem last Thursday that this was going to be the case. However, Trump on last Friday said that this wasn't the case and he hadn't agreed to anything. He said again on Tuesday that he wasn't going to reduce tariffs. And if there was going to be a reduction, the Chinese would have to give something up. So it seems like this might be a negotiating tactic, or that the Americans don't want to budge on this. In fact, the US Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer said in an interview yesterday that one of the reasons the American side want to keep those tariffs in place is because it's leverage to ensure that the Chinese live up to their side of the agreement going forward when it comes to purchases, and passing an effective framework for protecting American IP in China. So it's going to come down to these two things. Now, the market doesn't seem to care that much that Trump made these statements on Friday or earlier this week, because it's been humming away just fine, which is probably a reflection of the fact that the stock market in the US reacts more positively to news about the American economy and consumer spending and that sort of stuff, manufacturing numbers, and less so on manufacturing for export. This also drives home the point that the Chinese need this agreement more than the Americans do. Although in saying that, Trump would like to go into a 2020 presidential campaign with his base, i.e. manufacturing sectors and farm workers, covered. As always, guys, I will keep you updated as the trade relationship continues. We need to talk about Hong Kong. The movement that has been going on in the Fragrant Harbour against the Carrie Lam Special Administrative Region government has enjoyed overwhelming support from regular Hong Kongers and has been overwhelmingly peaceful. But from day one, there has always been a radical, violent element to the protests. That violence has become more intense and frequent over the last few weeks, and this week has been a particularly violent week on both sides. So what has happened? Well, on Monday there was a call for a general strike, and escalations began from the morning. On Monday, the police side fired live rounds into the protesters, critically injuring a 21-year-old. As at the filming of this video, that person is alive but still in critical condition in the hospital. The violence from some protesters has also been pretty intense. There's been accusations of bricks, Molotov cocktails, and even flaming arrows being fired at police and bystanders. Universities have been shut down for the semester and then are moving to online courses. Even the unprecedented move of shutting down primary and secondary school. Up until now, the protest movement has enjoyed wide mainstream support by regular Hong Kong society, which still places most of the blame for the unrest on the Hong Kong government and to a lesser extent the central government in Beijing. However, if the violence continues to escalate, then there is a risk that this element of the protest alienates either itself or a large part of the general protest movement from the mainstream society. In fact, this is probably what some people in the Lam government and in the central government in Beijing are hoping for. If that's the case, they just need to sit back and wait out the storm. So what's Beijing's response to the escalations this week been? Well, on Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning, there was a slew of stories that came out of the official media in Beijing condemning the violence, and in some articles calling for mainland forces to put down the unrest, aka sending in the People's Liberation Army or the People's Armed Police. Now, this is still unlikely, and some of the reasons for that we've discussed in earlier episodes, but what is most likely going to happen is the central government is going to leave it to the SAR government in Hong Kong to wait out the violence, put down the protests, and then Beijing will come in with a vengeance after the aftermath is over. Now, what do I mean by that? There was actually an interesting communique that was published by the central government after the fourth plenary session at the beginning of last week. This communique paints a very dark picture as to how the central government sees the future of Hong Kong, including greater central control over political appointment process, passing of national security laws like anti-separatist laws, and pushing patriotic education in Hong Kong schools. Now, let's talk about the Chinese economy, specifically issues with debt. As you probably know, the Chinese economy has been slowing, and this is the result of a policy move that is moving from a credit-run growth model to a growth model that's based on consumption and productivity gains. One of the reasons there is so much debt is because that credit-driven model has been used for so many years, and now the chickens have come back to roost, or whatever the saying is, something about chickens, cocks, roosters, I don't know. Anyway, has hit the fan. Now let's talk about the debt at the government level. You have the central government and the local government who both have debt issues. The local government is much more acute and severe, but to be honest, for all intents and purposes, this is actually one government. You have to remember, China, though it is quite decentralized in policy implementation, you do not have a distinct government at the local level versus the central level in terms of separate entities like you do in a federal system like the United States. A state is in charge of its own finances, and if it goes bankrupt, that doesn't affect the federal government too much in terms of liability. Of course, it creates political and economic issues, but there's a separate liability, or there's separate liability there. In China, the local government might as well be part of the central government. And for that matter, local financing vehicles, state-owned enterprises, state-run banks are all part of the public entity. So this is all really public debt. Now, if we look at government deficit levels for this year, it is now projected at about 5% if we take the government's numbers at its word. So it could actually be much worse. A fiscal deficit of 5% is actually a bigger deficit as a percentage of GDP than the American federal government's deficit. So if you think about that, we always read about how bad the budget in the United States at the federal government level is, but as a percentage of GDP, the government in China is actually worse. There's also been some interesting stories this week about some local default issues. So as of this month, over 800 local governments have defaulted on payments. Now this is compared to 100 total for all of last year, and the total quantity of outstanding payments for local governments has increased by 50% against last year to $1 billion US. Now, with all this issues with debt, you'd think that the deleveraging campaign would be going forward at all steam ahead. However, there have been several stories in the last month pointing to more money being printed, more borrowing, easing of credit limits. And as of yesterday, the central government announced that the minimum capital requirements for borrowing for infrastructure, which is one of the biggest expenses for central governments, has been reduced further, making it easier for local governments to borrow and at a higher leverage rate. So this sort of stuff is just exacerbating this credit issue that the government has rightly identified as a serious financial risk, but has failed to take real steps to try and fix. Okay guys, that's the quick and dirty. I'm sorry I've got this business trip. I'll be back to normal next week with a proper China update, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you're still watching and you enjoy it, make sure you smash that like button. It's a massive help. And if you do want to follow us or follow me, feel free to subscribe. We'd love to have you on board. This is Tony, and I'll see you next time on China Update.